June 12, 1962, Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay, 7 o'clock in the morning. Correctional Officer Bill Long began the morning count in cell block B. He had walked this routine 5 days a week for 3 years. Check each cell, verify the prisoner, mark the sheet, and move to the next. Cell 136, accounted for. Cell 138. Long stopped at the bars and looked in. The figure in the bunk lay facing the wall, blanket pulled up, unmoving. Long called the count. No response. He called again, louder this time. Nothing. Long stepped closer to the bars. Something about the shape under the blanket felt wrong. The angle of the head, the absolute stillness. He had seen men sleep through morning count before, but this was different. He reached through the bars with his flashlight and tapped what he thought was a shoulder. The blanket shifted. The head rolled slightly. Long directed his flashlight beam at the pillow. The face staring back at him was papier-mâché, molded soap and toilet paper, painted with crushed magazine ink, topped with real human hair, glued strand by strand to create a hairline. The eyes were closed, the expression peaceful. In the dim light of early morning, from even 3 feet away, it looked like a sleeping man. Long moved to cell 140. There was another dummy head, same construction, different face, cell 142, and another dummy 3 cells, 3 elaborate decoys, 3 missing prisoners. Within 2 minutes, alarms shattered the morning quiet across Alcatraz Island. Guards flooded the cell block. The warden was notified immediately. The FBI received a call before 8 o'clock. The Coast Guard launched patrol boats into the bay. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin had vanished from the most secure prison in America. They had escaped through a route that should not have existed, using tools that should not have been available, following a plan that had taken nearly a year to execute. More than 60 years have passed. The FBI never found them. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed sightings were ever made. The case remains open. This is the story of how 3 men accomplished what the federal government had declared impossible. Alcatraz Island sits in the center of San Francisco Bay, 1¼ miles from the nearest shore. The water surrounding the island is cold, averaging between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The currents are treacherous, moving at speeds that can reach 9 knots during tidal changes. The distance to land, combined with the water conditions, made the bay itself the prison's most effective wall. The federal government opened Alcatraz as a maximum security penitentiary in 1934, at the height of America's war on organized crime. The prison was designed for a specific purpose, to house criminals who had proven they could not be held in conventional facilities, men who had escaped from other prisons, men who had corrupted guards, incited riots, or demonstrated that standard security measures were insufficient. The prison administration made this philosophy explicit. The Bureau of Prisons did not send inmates to Alcatraz for the severity of their crimes. They sent men to Alcatraz because those men kept escaping from everywhere else. The cell house contained 3 parallel cell blocks housing a maximum of 548 cells. Each cell measured 5 feet by 9 feet, concrete floor, steel bars, a cot, a small sink, and a toilet, which allowed no privacy, no comfort. The cells were designed for containment, not rehabilitation. Security protocols reflected the assumption that every prisoner was constantly planning escape. Guards conducted formal counts 13 times every 24 hours. Tool control was exhaustive. Every wrench, screwdriver, and saw blade was logged when removed from storage, checked out under supervision, and accounted for when work details ended. The ratio of guards to prisoners was the highest in the federal system. Between 1934 and 1962, 36 prisoners were involved in 14 documented escape attempts. 23 were recaptured immediately. 6 were shot and killed during their attempts. 2 men drowned, their bodies recovered from the bay. 5 prisoners disappeared and were officially listed as missing and presumed drowned. The official record stated that no prisoner had ever successfully escaped Alcatraz alive, but the official record did not account for 3 men who arrived at Alcatraz in the early 1960s, each with extensive escape histories, each convinced that every prison had a weakness if you looked carefully enough. Frank Lee Morris was born September 1st, 1926 in Washington, D.C. His childhood was defined by instability. Orphaned young, he moved through a series of foster homes. By age 13, he had been arrested for his first crime. By 15, he was in juvenile detention. Morris's adult criminal career consisted primarily of burglary and armed robbery, crimes that generated modest proceeds and long sentences. What distinguished him was not the sophistication of his crimes, but his relentless determination to escape custody. He escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary while serving a 10-year sentence, recaptured. He escaped from the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, recaptured again. Each escape added years to his sentence and elevated his security classification. In January 1960, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Morris to Alcatraz. Intelligence testing conducted during his incarceration showed an IQ of 133, well above average, in the top 2% of the general population. Prison psychologists noted that Morris was observant, methodical, and patient. He did not seek confrontation with guards or other inmates. He studied routines. He noticed patterns. He spent his time thinking. Guards who worked Cell Block B later recalled that Morris was one of the quietest prisoners they had supervised. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He kept his cell immaculate. He never caused trouble. While they watched him, he was watching them, timing their rounds, noting which guards were vigilant and which were complacent, identifying the gaps in their observation. John William Anglin and his brother Clarence Anglin were born in Donaldsonville, Georgia, in 1930 and 1931, respectively. They were part of a large family, 13 children total, who worked as migrant farmers, moving through Georgia and Florida following seasonal harvests. Living in poverty, the Anglin brothers grew up in and around water. The family spent time near the Apalachicola River and Florida's Gulf Coast. John and Clarence learned to swim before they learned to read. They dove for oysters in cold water. They fished in strong currents. They understood how water moved, how cold affected the body, how to conserve energy when swimming long distances. This childhood education in water survival would later become crucial. In 1956, John and Clarence, along with their brother Alfred, robbed the Bank of Columbia in Alabama. The robbery netted $19,000. They were arrested within weeks. John and Clarence received sentences of 15 to 20 years and began serving time at the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta. They immediately began planning escapes. In 1958, they attempted to hide in a laundry truck leaving the prison. They were discovered before the truck departed. In 1960, they tried again, this time making it outside the prison walls and traveling nearly to the Florida border before being recaptured near Folkestone, Georgia. The Bureau of Prisons reviewed their files and made a determination. John and Clarence Anglin were incorrigible escape risks. In 1960, they were both transferred to Alcatraz. The fourth conspirator was Alan Clayton West, a career criminal serving his second term at Alcatraz for interstate car theft and burglary. West was included in the planning from the beginning. He would contribute crucial ideas to the escape plan. But on the night of the escape, he would fail to make it out of his cell, and that failure would ultimately provide the FBI with a complete account of how the escape was planned and executed. In early 1961, the prison administration assigned Frank Morris to cell 138 on the second tier of B block. By what appeared to be coincidence but may have been requested through prisoner job placement, John Anglin was placed in cell 140, 2 cells away. Clarence Anglin occupied cell 142. Alan West was in cell 144, directly adjacent to Clarence. The proximity was significant. Prisoners in adjacent cells could communicate during evening recreation periods during work details, and through whispered conversations after lights out. The four men quickly established contact. The cells in B block had a structural feature that was unremarkable to most prisoners, but critical to anyone thinking about escape. The rear wall of each cell was not solid concrete. It consisted of a concrete wall with a metal vent grille covering an opening approximately 6 inches by 9 inches. These vents connected to a utility corridor that ran behind the cells, a narrow maintenance space, roughly 3 feet wide, used by prison maintenance staff to access plumbing and electrical systems. The vents were far too small for a human body to pass through. The bars covering them were steel. The concrete surrounding them appeared solid. Frank Morris noticed something the designers had not considered. Alcatraz had been built as a military fortress in the 1860s before being converted to a military prison and then a federal penitentiary. Parts of the cell block dated back more than 70 years. The concrete had aged. The salt air from the bay, corrosive, persistent, unrelenting, had degraded the mortar. Moisture had penetrated the walls over decades of exposure. Morris conducted a simple test. Using a metal nail file, he scraped at the concrete around the edges of his vent. The concrete was softer than it should have been, not soft enough to crumble with a touch, but soft enough to be removed gradually, carefully, over time. If the vent opening could be widened to roughly 12 inches by 18 inches, a man could squeeze through into the utility corridor. From the utility corridor, ventilation shafts led upward to the cell house roof. From the roof, a drain pipe descended to ground level. From there, the northern shore of the island was accessible. The plan required months of work. It required tools that did not officially exist. It required absolute secrecy. It required the construction of dummy heads convincing enough to fool guards during night counts. It required building a raft capable of carrying 3 men across one of the most dangerous bodies of water in North America. Frank Morris believed it was possible. He brought the Anglin brothers into the discussion. They agreed. Alan West joined the conspiracy. The planning phase began in the spring of 1961. Acquiring tools inside Alcatraz required patience and opportunity. The prison's tool control system was designed to prevent exactly what Morris and the Anglins were attempting. Every tool was logged. Every checkout was documented. Every return was inspected. Stealing a hammer or screwdriver outright would trigger an immediate investigation, cell searches, and potentially lockdown. Morris approached the problem methodically. He did not need to steal complete tools. He needed to acquire or fabricate components that could function as tools. John Anglin worked periodic assignments in the prison's maintenance department. The work involved repairing furniture, painting, and minor construction projects. During these assignments, he had access to a workshop that contained metal scraps, broken saw blades, and discarded materials. Over the course of several months, he collected small pieces, a fragment of saw blade here, a scrap of metal there, bits of wire, items small enough to conceal in his clothing, individually insignificant enough that their absence went unnoticed. Clarence Anglin worked in the prison garment shop, sewing and repairing clothing and linens. This work gave him access to heavy-duty needles, strong thread, and fabric, materials that would later become essential for constructing flotation devices and a raft from stolen raincoats. Morris rotated through various work details, including kitchen duty and cell block cleaning assignments. These rotations allowed him to observe guard patterns across different times of day, to note which correctional officers were vigilant and which tended toward complacency, and to identify moments when supervision was minimal. From the scavenged materials, they fashioned improvised tools. A metal spoon stolen from the dining hall was filed down over weeks using concrete from the cell floor as an abrasive surface. The result was a crude but functional chisel. Pieces of saw blade were sharpened and fitted with improvised handles made from rolled paper and glue. The most sophisticated tool they created was a drill mechanism. They acquired a small electric motor from a broken vacuum cleaner that had been discarded during a maintenance replacement. West, who had some mechanical aptitude, modified the motor by extending its power cord so it could reach an electrical outlet inside the cell. They attached a drill bit fashioned from a sharpened metal rod. The device was crude but functional. The noise was the critical problem. Drilling into concrete produced a distinctive grinding sound that would carry down the cell block, especially during the quiet hours after lights out. Morris solved this through timing. The prison allowed limited recreational activities during evening hours. Some prisoners played musical instruments. Others listened to small radios. The ambient noise during recreation time provided acoustic cover. Additionally, one conspirator would maintain watch while another worked, ready to signal if a guard approached unexpectedly. The work proceeded slowly. Each night, they could remove only small amounts of concrete, enough to make progress, but not enough that the damage would be visible during daily cell inspections. They created false vent covers from painted cardboard, carefully matching the color and texture of the actual metal grills. From even a few feet away, with a flashlight beam in dim conditions, the fake covers were indistinguishable from the real ones. By late 1961, Morris had widened his vent opening enough that he could fit his head and shoulders through. The Anglins were making similar progress. Alan West was working on his vent but falling behind the others. The escape could only occur at night, after the final official count at 9:30 in the evening. But guards conducted periodic visual checks throughout the night, shining flashlights into cells at irregular intervals to verify that prisoners were in their bunks. If the men were gone, the guards needed to see something that looked like sleeping prisoners. Morris conceived the solution. Realistic dummy heads that could rest on pillows, visible in darkness, convincing enough to pass a flashlight inspection from several feet away. The construction process demonstrated remarkable craftsmanship. The base material was a mixture of soap chips and toilet paper. Soap was available in the cells. Toilet paper was unlimited. They mixed these materials with water to create a papier-mâché paste that could be molded while wet and would harden as it dried. Creating the forms required artistic skill. They needed to sculpt recognizable human faces with proper proportions: eye sockets, noses, cheekbones, chins. Morris worked on his own head for weeks, gradually building up layers, refining features, smoothing surfaces. Once the basic forms were complete, they needed to be painted to resemble skin. Paint was not available. They improvised by stealing small amounts from the maintenance department and by crushing pages from magazines to extract colored ink. They mixed these materials to approximate skin tones, adding shading to create the illusion of depth, darker pigment in eye sockets and under cheekbones, lighter tones on raised surfaces. The most important detail was hair. A bald dummy head would be immediately suspicious. They needed realistic hair that matched their own. For months, they collected hair from the prison barbershop floor. Every 2 weeks, when prisoners received haircuts, small amounts of clipped hair would be swept into corners and disposed of. Before the sweeping, conspirators would palm small amounts of hair and smuggle it back to the cells. The collection process took months because they needed substantial quantities and because taking too much at once would be noticed. They glued the collected hair to the dummy heads strand by strand, using adhesive made from soap and paste. They created hairlines, filled in the scalp coverage, and even added suggestions of stubble and eyebrows using shorter hair fragments and paint. The completed heads were disturbingly lifelike. In full daylight, they would not withstand close scrutiny, but in the darkness of a cell at night, illuminated only by a brief flashlight beam, they were convincing. They tested the dummies during the preparation phase. A prisoner would place his dummy on the pillow, arrange blankets to suggest a body, then hide in the shadows near the cell bars to observe guard reactions during late-night checks. The guards noticed nothing unusual. Morris created a head for himself. John Anglin created his own. Clarence did the same. Alan West, despite his later failure to escape, also completed a dummy head, indicating his full intention to participate until the final night. By early 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers had widened their vent openings enough to pass through into the utility corridor behind the cells. The corridor was dark, cramped, and rarely entered by guards or maintenance staff except during specific repair work. Access to the corridor was only the first stage. The corridor itself was merely a passage between the cells and the outer structure of the prison. To reach the roof, they needed to access ventilation shafts that ran vertically from the corridor to the cell house ceiling. Over many nights, working in complete darkness, they explored the corridor and located the ventilation shaft. These shafts were sealed with iron bars and metal grillwork designed specifically to prevent prisoners from using them as escape routes. They began removing the barriers. Using their improvised tools, they chiseled away concrete around the bars, bent metal where possible, and gradually created openings large enough to climb through. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The shafts were vertical, narrow, and pitch black. A fall would result in serious injury and immediate discovery. By April 1962, they had created a route from the cells through the utility corridor, up through the ventilation shaft and onto the flat roof of the cell house. They had tested the route multiple times, climbing up and returning before morning count. The roof presented new challenges. It was exposed, overlooked by guard towers, swept by searchlights at irregular intervals. But Morris and the Anglins had studied the patterns for months. They identified blind spots in the surveillance. They noted the timing of light sweeps. They found a route across the roof to the northern edge, where a large ventilation pipe descended 50 feet to ground level near the prison powerhouse. Every detail was mapped. Every movement rehearsed mentally. Every contingency considered. They were nearly ready. In mid-April 1962, approximately 6 weeks before the planned escape, the preparation nearly collapsed. Correctional Officer Frank Heaney was conducting a routine cell inspection during the afternoon work period when most prisoners were out on details. Heaney was more thorough than some of the other guards, a detail-oriented officer who took his responsibilities seriously. He stopped at cell 138. Frank Morris was at his work assignment, so the cell was empty. Heaney entered to conduct the inspection. He checked the usual locations: under the mattress, inside the sink cabinet, behind the toilet. Everything appeared normal. Then he noticed something on the floor near the rear vent. Concrete dust. Just a small amount, easily missed, but present in a quantity that suggested recent disturbance. Heaney walked to the rear of the cell and examined the vent grill more closely. He noticed fine scratches around the edges of the metal. Fresh scratches, not the aged patina of years-old installation marks. He called for the cell block officer and requested a tool. When the officer returned with a screwdriver, Heaney tested the vent grill. It was seated properly. He could not remove it without tools. But the concrete around it seemed softer than he expected. Heaney filed a report noting possible tampering with vent fixture in cell 138 and recommended follow-up inspection. That evening, when prisoners returned from work details, Morris learned through another inmate that his cell had received extra attention during afternoon inspection. He did not know exactly what the guard had seen, but he knew that attention had been drawn to the vent. During recreation time, Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin held a whispered conference in a corner of the common area. They had invested nearly a year into the plan. The vents were widened but not quite finished. The raft was under construction but not complete. The route to the roof was accessible, but they had not yet conducted a full test run with all equipment. If Heaney's report triggered a more intensive investigation, if maintenance staff removed the vent covers and discovered the widened openings, if the prison administration ordered cell searches and found the dummy heads or raft materials, the entire plan would collapse. They would face additional charges, extended sentences, transfer to even higher security facilities, and the end of any hope of escape. They faced a decision. Abort the plan now, destroy the evidence, and abandon a year of work, or accelerate the timeline, accept elevated risk, and attempt the escape before the administration acted on Heaney's report. Morris analyzed the variables. Heaney's report had not resulted in immediate cell searches, which suggested the administration was not treating it as urgent. The concrete dust could be explained as routine deterioration. The scratches could have been there for years. If they acted quickly and carefully, they might have a narrow window before anyone looked more closely. The Anglin brothers agreed with Morris's assessment. Alan West, who was already behind schedule on widening his vent, expressed concern but committed to working faster. They made the decision to accelerate. Work intensified immediately. Night work became more aggressive, accepting slightly more risk in exchange for faster progress. The raft construction, previously careful and methodical, became a rushed assembly process. The timeline compressed from late June to as soon as possible. The margin for error had vanished. They needed to move now or the opportunity would disappear forever. By early June, Morris and the Anglin brothers had completed their preparations. Their vents were wide enough. The route to the roof was ready. The raft was functional, if not perfect. The dummy heads were finished. Alan West was still working on his vent. He was close, but not quite ready. The others told him to hurry. They could wait only so long. They selected the night of June 11th for the escape. The decision was based on multiple factors. Tidal charts indicated favorable conditions. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies and mild temperatures. The guard rotation on that particular Monday night included officers who were known to be less vigilant during late-night checks. On the evening of June 11th, 1962, as the sun set over San Francisco Bay and the lights of the city began to glow across the water, Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West prepared for the attempt that would either free them or kill them. The escape required flotation. This was not optional. The distance from Alcatraz's northern shore to the nearest accessible land, Angel Island, or the Marin Headlands, was more than a mile. The water temperature in early June averaged 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The currents in San Francisco Bay were among the most dangerous in any urban waterway in America, moving at speeds that could exceed 6 knots during tidal changes. Swimming that distance in those conditions without flotation was not survivable. The prison administration knew this. The water itself was considered the most effective security measure on the island. Between 1934 and 1962, multiple prisoners had attempted to escape Alcatraz by water. The results provided clear data on what happened to human bodies in the bay. Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe disappeared in December 1937 after escaping from a work detail. They entered the water during a severe storm. Neither body was ever recovered. They were presumed drowned, though the lack of bodies left some uncertainty. James Borman was shot and killed in the water during a 1943 escape attempt. His companions were recaptured. In December 1962, 7 months after the Morris Anglin escape, a prisoner named John Paul Scott would attempt to swim from Alcatraz to San Francisco. Scott made it to the shore at Fort Point, making him one of the few prisoners to successfully reach land from the island. Fishermen found him unconscious on the rocks, his body temperature dangerously low, suffering from severe hypothermia. He survived only because he reached land within approximately 30 minutes. He was recaptured within hours, still too weak to walk. Scott's attempt provided crucial data that later investigators would use to assess the Morris Anglin escape. 30 minutes in 53-degree water brought a fit adult male to the edge of death. Beyond 30 minutes, hypothermia became irreversible. The body's core temperature would drop below the point where the heart could maintain regular rhythm. Death would follow quickly. Morris and the Anglins understood these realities. They needed insulation and buoyancy. They needed a raft. The prison issued rubberized raincoats to inmates who worked outside details. The raincoats were made of canvas fabric coated with a waterproof rubber compound. The material was durable, flexible, and, critically, could be sealed to trap air. Over the course of many months, the conspirators stole more than 50 raincoats. The thefts were gradual and dispersed. A raincoat would go missing from a work detail. Another would disappear from storage. The losses were noted in inventory reports, but never in quantities large enough to trigger intensive investigation. Guards assumed the coats were being lost, damaged, or discarded rather than systematically stolen. The stolen raincoats were smuggled back to the cells in pieces, folded flat under clothing, wrapped around bodies beneath prison uniforms, carried in laundry bags. Once in the cells, the materials were hidden in the utility corridor behind the widened vents. Clarence Anglin, with his experience in the prison tailor shop, led the construction effort. The design was functional rather than sophisticated. They would sew multiple raincoats together to create a large envelope approximately 6 feet by 14 feet. The seams needed to be waterproof. They achieved this by double-stitching the seams and then sealing them with contact cement stolen in small quantities from the maintenance shop. The raft would be inflated by mouth, with all 3 men blowing air into the opening until the envelope reached sufficient pressure to support their combined weight. Wooden paddles were carved from materials scavenged from the workshop, pieces of plywood smuggled out over weeks, shaped using improvised tools, light enough to be effective, but sturdy enough not to break. In addition to the raft, they constructed individual life vests. Each vest consisted of a raincoat that had been sealed and could be inflated to provide buoyancy around the torso. The vests served 2 purposes, flotation and insulation. Every layer of air between the body and the water was a few additional minutes of survival time. The Anglin brothers had one advantage that Morris lacked: extensive cold water experience. John and Clarence had grown up swimming and diving in the Apalachicola River in Florida. Winter water temperatures in the Apalachicola could drop into the mid-50s, comparable to San Francisco Bay. They had spent their childhoods working in that water, diving for oysters, learning through direct physical experience how cold water affected the body. Cold water does not kill through freezing. It kills through exhaustion. The human body, when immersed in cold water, immediately begins burning enormous amounts of energy to generate heat. Muscles consume glucose rapidly. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes labored. Within 15 to 20 minutes, muscle coordination begins to fail. Within 30 minutes, the body's energy reserves are depleted and swimming becomes impossible. The person simply stops moving and drowns. The Anglin brothers understood this. They knew that the life vests were not just about staying afloat, they were about preserving core body temperature long enough to reach land. They knew they would need to pace themselves to avoid thrashing movements that would burn energy faster, to stay calm even as the cold sapped their strength. By early June, the raft and life vests were complete. They were hidden in the utility corridor, ready to be carried up to the roof and down to the shore on the night of the escape. The week of June 4th through June 10th, 1962 was the most dangerous period of the entire operation. The accelerated timeline meant that all 4 conspirators were working frantically to complete preparations while maintaining the appearance of normal prison routine. Frank Morris spent his days on kitchen duty and his nights in the utility corridor, making final checks of the roof route. He climbed the ventilation shaft multiple times, timing how long each stage would take, identifying potential obstacles in darkness, ensuring that the path was clear and navigable without light. John and Clarence Anglin completed the final stitching on the raft and tested the inflation process. They could not test the raft in water. Any attempt to do so would be immediately discovered. Instead, they inflated it in the utility corridor, checked for leaks by listening for air escaping, made repairs, and deflated it again. The entire inflation and deflation cycle took approximately 20 minutes. On the night of the escape, this would need to happen quickly and silently on the shore. Alan West continued working on his vent. He was close to finishing but still not quite ready. The concrete around his vent was harder than the others had encountered. His progress was slower. The other 3 urged him to work faster. West promised he would be ready by June 11th. On June 8th, a guard conducted a random cell inspection in B block. The inspection was routine, not triggered by specific suspicion. The guard entered several cells, including Morris's, and checked for contraband. He noted nothing unusual. The fake vent covers held up under casual examination. This close call reinforced the urgency. Every additional day increased the risk that someone would look more carefully at the right cell at the wrong time. On June 10th, the day before the planned escape, Morris and the Anglins reviewed the plan one final time during afternoon recreation. They discussed contingencies. If the raft failed after entering the water, they would stay together and attempt to swim to the nearest shore. If they were separated by currents, each man would make for land independently and regroup later if possible. If one of them was injured or unable to continue, the others would not wait. Each man accepted these terms. They discussed what they would do after reaching shore. They had no detailed plan for this phase, acquiring transportation, obtaining civilian clothing, leaving the Bay Area. The plan ended at landfall. Everything after that would be improvised. They agreed to split up after reaching shore to reduce the chance of all three being captured together. Alan West was included in these discussions, but his status had become uncertain. On the evening of June 10th, his vent was still not wide enough for him to fit through. He told the others he would work through the night and would be ready by the following evening. Morris told West they would proceed at midnight on June 11th regardless. West could catch up if he finished his vent in time. June 11th arrived. The day was clear and mild. The bay was relatively calm. Tidal charts indicated that the currents between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning would be ebbing, flowing out toward the Golden Gate, but with a lateral push toward Angel Island and the Marin Headlands. This was as favorable as conditions would get. Evening recreation period proceeded normally. The four conspirators gave no indication that anything unusual was planned. After recreation, prisoners returned to their cells. The 9:30 count was conducted. All prisoners were accounted for. Lights went out at 10 o'clock. The escape would begin shortly after. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, Frank Morris placed his dummy head on his pillow. He arranged his blanket to suggest a sleeping body. He positioned the head carefully, turned slightly toward the wall as he typically slept. In the darkness, the dummy was indistinguishable from a real person. Morris squeezed through the widened vent into the utility corridor. The opening was tight but navigable. He had practiced this movement dozens of times. He pulled his supplies through after him, a bundle containing his portion of the raft materials and his life vest. John Anglin followed the same process in cell 140. Then Clarence in cell 142. Alan West attempted to follow from cell 144. His vent opening was not wide enough. He had widened it as much as possible over the previous weeks, but the last few inches of concrete had proven more resistant than expected. He tried to force himself through. His shoulders would not fit. West retreated back into his cell and began scraping frantically at the concrete around the vent, using his improvised chisel. He worked as quietly as possible, aware that any loud noise would alert guards. The concrete yielded slowly. Minutes passed. Then an hour. In the utility corridor, Morris and the Anglin brothers waited. They had agreed to wait 15 minutes for West. Then they would proceed without him. 15 minutes elapsed. West had not appeared. They could hear faint, scraping sounds from his cell, indicating he was still working, but they could not wait longer. Every additional minute increased the risk of discovery. Morris signaled to the Anglins. They moved toward the ventilation shaft. Alan West continued scraping at his vent for another 2 hours. By midnight, he had widened the opening enough that he thought he could fit through. He placed his dummy head on his pillow and attempted to squeeze through the vent again. This time, he made it through, but barely. The effort exhausted him, and he had lost precious time. He knew the others had proceeded to the roof. He attempted to follow, climbing the ventilation shaft in darkness. When West reached the roof access point, he found it empty. The others had already descended to the shore. He briefly considered attempting to catch up, but he realized the futility. Without knowing exactly where they had descended or where they had gone, he would be climbing around the exposed roof alone, in darkness, with no backup plan. If he was discovered, the entire operation would be compromised, and the others might still be on the island. West made a decision. He would not continue. He climbed back down the shaft, returned through the utility corridor to his cell, replaced his vent cover, removed his dummy head, and went to bed. He would be present in his cell when guards conducted the morning count. His participation in the escape attempt ended there. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin climbed the ventilation shaft to the cell house roof. The shaft was vertical, narrow, and completely dark. They climbed by feel, bracing their backs against one wall and their feet against the opposite wall, inching upward. Each man carried supplies, sections of the raft, life vests, paddles. The climb took approximately 15 minutes. They emerged onto the roof through an access panel that they had previously loosened. The roof was flat, covered with gravel and tar paper. The night was clear. The lights of San Francisco glowed across the water less than 2 miles away. The air was cool but not cold, approximately 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Guard towers were visible at the corners of the island. Searchlights swept the perimeter at irregular intervals. Morris and the Anglins moved low and fast, timing their movements between light sweeps. They had studied these patterns for months. They knew where the blind spots were. They crossed the roof to the northern edge, where a large ventilation pipe descended to ground level. The pipe was approximately 2 feet in diameter, made of metal, warm from the heat of the prison's ventilation system. It ran down the exterior wall of the cell house, descending 50 feet to the ground near the powerhouse building. Morris descended first, gripping the pipe with his hands and legs, sliding down in a controlled descent. The technique was similar to the firefighter's pole technique, enough friction to control speed, but not so much that he stopped moving. The descent took less than 30 seconds. John Anglin descended next, then Clarence. All three reached the ground without incident. They were now outside the main prison structure, but still on the island, still within the security perimeter. They moved quickly toward the northern shore, staying in shadows. Avoiding areas lit by perimeter lights, the northern shore of Alcatraz consisted of rocky beach and concrete rubble, the remnants of old military fortifications. The shoreline was unguarded but visible from certain guard towers. The men moved to a sheltered area partially concealed by large rocks and began assembling the raft. The raft had been carried to the roof in sections. Now they unfolded it, connected the pieces, and began the inflation process. All three men blew air into the opening, working in rotation, one breathing into the raft while the others rested and kept watch. Inflation took approximately 20 minutes. The raft reached sufficient pressure to float and support weight. They sealed the opening. They attached the wooden paddles, 2 paddles total, carved from scrap wood, crude but functional. Each man inflated his life vest. The vests went on over their prison clothing. The rubberized raincoat material trapped air against their torsos, providing both buoyancy and insulation. The bay stretched before them. The water was dark, reflecting no light, moving with visible currents. The distance to the nearest land was approximately 1¼ miles to Angel Island, slightly farther to the Marin Headlands. The time was approximately 11:45 at night. The tide was ebbing, flowing out toward the Golden Gate with a lateral push northeast. Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin pushed the raft into the water and climbed aboard. The water temperature was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The shock of cold was immediate. Water seeped into their shoes, soaked through their pants. The life vests provided some insulation but not complete protection. They could feel the cold, leaching heat from their legs and feet. They began paddling. The first strokes were strong. The raft moved forward, sluggish but responsive to the paddles. The current caught them almost immediately, pulling them away from the island, pushing them northeast. Behind them, Alcatraz receded. The prison lights remained visible. Guard towers swept searchlights across the island perimeter, but none illuminated the water where they drifted. Within 5 minutes, they were far enough from shore that discovery from the island was unlikely. The physical reality of paddling became clear quickly. The raft was not streamlined. It caught the wind, which pushed them off course. The paddles were light and flexed when they pulled hard. Each stroke moved them forward only a few feet. Progress was agonizingly slow. The cold was relentless. Water temperature in San Francisco Bay does not vary significantly between the surface and depth. At 53 degrees, heat transfer from the body to the water occurs rapidly. Despite the life vests, despite their clothing, despite their physical exertion, they were losing body heat. The Anglin brothers understood what was happening. They had experienced this before in the cold rivers of Florida. They knew the progression. First, the extremities go numb, fingers, toes, ears. Then muscle coordination begins to fail. Then fine motor control disappears. Then gross motor control weakens. Then the body stops generating heat faster than it is losing it, and core temperature begins to drop. At that point, death is no longer a matter of if, but when. They focused on technique, short, steady strokes rather than powerful pulls that would burn energy faster. Steady breathing. Avoid panic. Conserve strength. Keep moving. The current carried them northeast toward Angel Island. The island was a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. Distance was difficult to judge in darkness, but the island appeared to be growing slowly larger. They were making progress. Time became difficult to track. Minutes felt like hours. The cold made everything slower. Their muscles ached from the constant paddling. Water sloshed inside the raft, soaking through their clothing. The wind picked up, creating small waves that splashed over the sides. At some point, perhaps 30 minutes after leaving Alcatraz, perhaps 40, John Anglin noticed that his fingers were no longer responding properly. He could grip the paddle, but he could not feel it. His hands were numb. He kept paddling, by muscle memory, watching his hands to ensure they maintained their grip. Clarence experienced similar symptoms. Morris, who had less cold water experience than the Anglins, began shivering violently, an involuntary response as his body attempted to generate heat through muscle contractions. They paddled on. The distance to Angel Island closed gradually. The island's shoreline became visible, rocky beach, vegetation above the waterline. They were approaching land. The current began pushing them parallel to the island rather than directly toward it. They adjusted their paddling, angling toward shore, fighting the current. The effort was exhausting. Each stroke felt heavier than the last. Then, possibly 50 yards from the Angel Island shore, the current changed. A strong lateral flow caught the raft, pulling them past the island. They paddled harder, attempting to reach shore before the current carried them away. The historical record provides no definitive answer to what happened next. No witnesses observed them reaching land. No physical evidence from that night survived, except for items that later washed ashore. The FBI investigation that followed could not conclusively determine whether Morris and the Anglins reached land or drowned in the bay. What is known is that 2 days after the escape, footprints matching standard prison-issue shoes were found on Angel Island's northern shore. The prints led from the water's edge into the island's interior, then disappeared. A blue 1955 Chevrolet was reported stolen from a driveway in Marin County on the night of June 11th. The car was recovered 3 weeks later in Stockton, California, approximately 80 miles inland. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints. In the days following the escape, several small thefts were reported from boats and waterfront properties. Near the Marin headlands, food, clothing, a small amount of cash. The thefts were never conclusively linked to the escapees, but the timing and pattern suggested desperate men outfitting themselves after coming ashore. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were never seen again. At 7 o'clock on the morning of June 12, 1962, Officer Bill Long walked the morning count in cell block B. He moved down the tier, checking each cell, marking his sheet, cell 136. Prisoner present, cell 138. Long stopped and called count. The figure in the bunk did not respond. Long stepped closer and saw the impossible angle of the head, the unnatural stillness. He reached through the bars and touched the head. It was papier-mâché. Within minutes, the alarm sounded across Alcatraz. Guards converged on B block. The warden, Olin Blackwell, was notified immediately. Prisoners were ordered to remain in their cells. A full count was conducted. 3 prisoners were missing: Frank Lee Morris, John William Anglin, Clarence Anglin. 1 prisoner was present in his cell who should not have been able to ignore the alarm: Alan Clayton West. Guards entered West's cell and ordered him to explain his presence. West initially claimed ignorance. Under intensive questioning that morning, he broke. West described the entire operation in detail. He explained the widened vents, the utility corridor route, the roof access, the raft construction. He described the dummy heads, the tools, the months of preparation. He provided names, timeline, methods. He explained that he had intended to escape but had failed to widen his vent in time. He admitted he had attempted to follow but had turned back. He claimed the others had abandoned him deliberately. West's confession provided investigators with a complete blueprint of the escape. Within hours, FBI agents were examining the vent openings, the utility corridor, the ventilation shaft, the roof route. They found everything West had described. On the shore, they found footprints leading to the water. They found scraps of raincoat material. They found a piece of wood that appeared to be part of a paddle. The FBI San Francisco office opened an intensive investigation. The Coast Guard deployed patrol boats to search the bay. Aircraft conducted aerial searches. The Bureau of Prisons issued alerts to law enforcement agencies across California and beyond. In the days following the escape, evidence began washing ashore. A paddle, crude and handmade, was found floating near Angel Island. A life vest made from raincoat material washed up on the Marin shore. A packet wrapped in rubber containing names and addresses, contacts for the Anglin family was recovered near Cronkite Beach. These discoveries seemed to confirm the theory that the raft had failed and the men had drowned. The FBI investigation proceeded on this assumption. Agents began interviewing family members, particularly the Anglin family in Florida, but no bodies were found. Days became weeks. The search expanded. FBI agents surveilled the Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida. They monitored mail. They tapped phone lines. They interviewed anyone who might have been contacted by the escapees. No credible sightings emerged. No contact was made. No evidence of survival surfaced. 2 months after the escape, Alcatraz officials held a press conference. They acknowledged the escape methods and described the investigation. They were asked directly, did the escapees survive? The response was carefully worded. No evidence has been found that indicates these men survived. Based on the conditions in San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11th and the items recovered in subsequent days, it is the assessment of this office that Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin drowned shortly after entering the water. But the FBI did not close the case. The absence of bodies meant uncertainty. The agency continued to investigate leads for years. In 1962, the Anglin family received a Christmas card postmarked from Los Angeles. The handwriting resembled John Anglin's. When questioned by the FBI, family members could not explain the card's origin. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. Throughout the 1970s, the Anglin family received occasional phone calls. The callers never identified themselves but made references that only family members would understand. The calls were brief, placed from payphones in various cities. Impossible to trace with the technology available at that time. In 1975, a photograph allegedly taken in Brazil surfaced decades later when the Anglin family provided it to investigators in 2015. The photo showed two men standing together. The family claimed these were John and Clarence, photographed 13 years after the escape. Forensic analysis conducted in 2015 was inconclusive. The image quality was insufficient for definitive facial recognition, and the photograph's provenance could not be verified. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. The letter was not made public until 2018 when its contents were revealed. The letter claimed to be from John Anglin. The author wrote, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I am 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer." Frank passed away in October 2008. His grave is in Argentina under another name. My brother died in 2011. The letter proposed a deal: medical treatment in exchange for confirmation of identity and surrender. The author offered to serve no more than 1 year in prison. The FBI analyzed the letter. Handwriting comparison with John Anglin's known samples from before his imprisonment was inconclusive. Some characteristics matched, others did not. The letter could have been authentic. It could have been an elaborate hoax. The FBI attempted to contact the letter writer through the means indicated. No response was ever received. The case remains open. The U.S. Marshals Service continues to maintain active files on Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin. Age-progressed photographs show what the men would look like in their 80s and 90s. Leads are still investigated when they arise. More than 60 years have passed since the escape. If Morris and the Anglins survived that night in San Francisco Bay, they are almost certainly dead now from natural causes. They would be in their 90s if still alive. The Bay has kept its secrets. No remains have ever been definitively identified as belonging to any of the three men. No confession has closed the mystery. No proof of survival has emerged that investigators consider conclusive. Three men walked through walls of concrete and steel, climbed through darkness to a prison roof, descended to the shore, and pushed a raft made of stolen raincoats into one of the most dangerous bodies of water in North America. Then they vanished. The FBI never found them. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed permanently on March 21, 1963, less than 10 months after the Morris-Anglin escape. The official reason cited operational costs. The prison was expensive to maintain, and the salt air from the bay caused continuous deterioration of the buildings and infrastructure. But the escape had exposed fundamental vulnerabilities that could not be easily corrected without massive reconstruction. The federal government acknowledged what prison administrators had always known. The water was the real security measure at Alcatraz, and if prisoners could build a functional raft, the prison was not truly escape-proof. The island sat abandoned for several years before the federal government transferred it to the National Park Service. In 1973, Alcatraz opened to the public as a historic site and museum. Today, more than 1 million visitors tour the island annually, walking through the cell block where Morris and the Anglins once lived. Standing in the utility corridor, they navigated in darkness, examining the dummy heads behind protective glass. Cell 138, Frank Morris's cell, remains preserved as it was found on the morning of June 12, 1962. The widened vent opening is visible. A replica dummy head sits on the pillow. Visitors can see exactly how the deception worked and how close the guards came to the truth every night without realizing it. The escape has become part of American criminal folklore, inspiring books, films, documentaries, and countless theories about what happened to the three men after they entered San Francisco Bay. In 2014, a team of Dutch researchers conducted a comprehensive scientific analysis of the escape using modern computer modeling and historical data. The researchers input every variable they could verify: tidal charts from June 11-12, 1962, water temperature records, current speeds, wind conditions, raft specifications based on FBI evidence, and the estimated physical condition of the escapees. The computer model ran thousands of simulations, calculating different scenarios based on when the men entered the water and how efficiently they paddled. The results surprised many observers, who had assumed drowning was inevitable. The study concluded that if Morris and the Anglins entered the water between 11:30 at night and 12:30 in the morning, and if they paddled consistently toward Angel Island or the Marin Headlands rather than trying to reach San Francisco directly, they had a significant probability of reaching land alive. The ebbing tide during that time window created a current pattern that would have pushed them northeast toward the Marin shore, exactly where the footprints were later found. The study acknowledged that survival depended on multiple factors: maintaining body temperature, avoiding panic, paddling efficiently, and having the physical stamina to continue for at least 45 minutes to an hour. But the researchers concluded that survival was not only possible but plausible, especially given the Anglin brothers' documented cold water swimming experience. The study did not prove that the men survived, but it established that the widely accepted theory of inevitable drowning was not supported by the physical evidence and scientific analysis. The FBI reviewed the Dutch study but did not change its official assessment. The Bureau maintained that absent definitive proof of survival, the presumption remained that Morris and the Anglins drowned in the bay. The United States Marshals Service took a different position. The Marshals Service, which assumes jurisdiction over escaped federal prisoners, kept the case active. Age-progressed photographs were generated showing what the three men would look like at various ages. The photographs were updated periodically and circulated to law enforcement agencies. In interviews, U.S. Marshals involved in the case have stated that they believe there is a reasonable possibility the men survived. They point to the lack of bodies, the physical evidence suggesting landfall, the circumstantial evidence of the stolen car, and the unexplained contacts with the Anglin family over the years. The Marshals Service investigates credible leads when they arise. Tips still come in occasionally, claiming sightings or knowledge of the escapees' fate. Most leads are quickly determined to be mistaken identity or hoaxes. A few remain unresolved. More than 60 years have passed since Frank Morris. John Anglin and Clarence Anglin disappeared into San Francisco Bay. If they survived that night, if they reached land and successfully evaded capture, they lived as fugitives for the remainder of their lives using false identities, avoiding detection by federal law enforcement, and never returning to the families they left behind. If they drowned, their bodies were carried out to sea by the tidal currents, lost to the Pacific Ocean, and the greatest prison escape in American history ended in the cold water less than an hour after it began. The truth remains unknown. The case remains open. The FBI file on the Alcatraz escape is one of the longest-running investigations in the Bureau's history, spanning more than 6 decades without resolution. What is certain is that 3 men accomplished what the federal government declared impossible. They planned for nearly a year with meticulous attention to detail. They created tools from scraps, dummy heads from soap and toilet paper, and a raft from stolen raincoats. They widened concrete vents using improvised chisels, navigated a pitch-black utility corridor, and climbed through ventilation shafts to reach the roof. They descended 50 feet down a pipe, assembled their raft on the shore, and entered water cold enough to kill them within half an hour. They refused to accept that Alcatraz was inescapable. They studied the prison's routines and weaknesses until they found a path that no one else had seen. They executed their plan with precision and courage, whether they lived or died in the attempt. They proved that no prison is truly escape-proof if the prisoners are patient enough, clever enough and determined enough to find the narrow margin between captivity and freedom. This was their narrow escape, and more than 60 years later, it remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Stories like this one, true accounts of impossible odds overcome through ingenuity and determination, are what this channel exists to tell. From prison escapes to wilderness survival, from maritime disasters to wartime heroics, these are the moments when ordinary people refused to surrender to circumstances that should have destroyed them. Every week, we bring you a new story researched thoroughly, told carefully and always true. If this account of the Alcatraz escape held your attention, there are dozens more stories waiting, each as compelling, each as impossible and each as real as the three men who vanished from America's most secure prison on a June night in 1962. Subscribe to The Narrow Escape for more true stories of survival, escape and the refusal to accept impossible odds. Because sometimes, against every logical expectation, people find a way through.